presentation, but sessions. Our speaker is Professor Dr. Burçin Erol. I am happy to present a very distinguished colleague and a very dear friend. Although she needs no introduction, a brief bio, I think, is in order. Professor Erol received her BA from the Department of English Language and Literature at Hacettepe University. She received her MA and PhD from the same department. Her PhD dissertation is titled A Pageant of Well-Dressed People, a study of Chaucer's costume imagery in Canterbury Tales. She also received an MA in medieval English literature in 1989 from Leeds University. She's been working at Hacettepe University since her graduation, and at present she is head of the English department at Hacettepe University. Her research, teaching, and publication areas are medieval English literature, women writers, women poets, English poetry, post-colonial British literature, translation, mythology, and food culture. She has translated the general prologue to the Canterbury Tales into Turkish, published by Gündoğan in 1993. She is published Türkiye'de 1928-93 yılları arasında yapılan Ortaçağ başlangıçtan 1500'lere kadar İngiliz edebiyatı çalışmalarının bibliografyası. The first publication was in 1995, but she updated it in 2016 to cover the years 1928 to 2014. This time published by Ürün Yayınları. She's collaborated with two other writers for Akademik Yazım İhlalleri, published by TÜBİTAK. And last but not least, she has edited 5 volumes of Irish writers series, James Joyce, Yeats, Beckett, Oscar Wilde, and Seamus Heaney, and I think Shaw is on the way. Okay, and Professor Erol's talk today is titled Chaucer's Use of Food Imagery in Canterbury Tales. Professor Burçin Erol.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I would like to congratulate the university and the department on their 20th anniversary. Time seems to fly. I remember visiting dear colleagues and very dear professors of mine in the barracks, which no longer exists today. And I would also like to thank the organizers once again for this very friendly, very academic, very nice day they have created for us. It's like an academic oasis in the middle of all the paperwork, all the difficulties of academic life. As you can see, I'm engaged with Chaucer. I almost gave a heart attack to my husband. I said, all my life has been invaded by 2 males. One knew, the other one Chaucer. So back to Chaucer again. Chaucer, in his Canterbury Tales, makes extensive use of food culture and food imagery in the creation of the pilgrims in the general prologue and also in the depiction of some of the characters in the tales. In fact, the general prologue begins with the narration of Chaucer the Pilgrim's comment on how the pilgrims met at the Tabard Inn and how they were well served by the innkeeper Harry Bailey. Both in a realistic setting and in a metaphorical way, Chaucer employs food culture in his work. In medieval England, food is an extremely important marker of class, identity, estate, religion, and gender. Medieval sumptuary laws and social traditions tried to establish definite boundaries defining the consumption of the varieties of food according to income and class, hence indicating the consumption of meat, spices, and varieties of bread each estate could eat. Thus, food became an indicator of class, status, and wealth. Similarly, religious orders defined the consumption of the kinds of food as vegetarian and fish, the times and days of consumption, and fasting in relation to established beliefs of taming the flesh and encouraging abstinence to avoid worldly desires and sin. Moreover, due to the medicinal beliefs and the formulation of the bodily humors, it was a direct agent in the management and cure of the bodily excesses and deficiencies. The food culture of the Middle Ages also involved the close connection of body, bodily desires, and types of food consumed. Anderson underlines the fact that food is an agent in defining one's identity and place in society, and like many other food specialists, he adds that it is a communicator of class, ethnic identity, lifestyle, affiliation, and other social positions. Moreover, he states that food is secondary only to language as a social communication system, unquote. Chaucer makes conscious and extensive use of food items, dietary habits, and metaphors in the creation of the pilgrims in the general prologue, especially in the portraits of the monk, prioress, franklin, cook, and the summoner, in the depiction of these characters, indicating their estate and religious identities, as well as their presumptions, aspirations, and sins. Similarly, in the depiction of some of the female characters in the Fablieux, such as Alison in the Miller's Tale and May in the Reeve's Tale, women are depicted in food references and terms, indicating the female body as an object of consumption. The mention of food items in the portraits in the general prologue make literal use of food culture, and it can be asserted that, in comparison to other contemporary medieval literary works, the Canterbury Tales makes extensive use of food culture. References to some items of food in feasting scenes of romances to indicate courtly richness and festivity, and mention of some food items in estate satire was common. But Chaucer employs food culture in a very intensive way. Basically, in the general prologue, there are literary references to food items, consumption habits, food taboos, which enhance the depiction of the characters, indicating their class, estate, and personal traits. However, Chaucer also employs food similes and metaphors to emphasize class, gender, and power hierarchies. As the critics point out, Chaucer relies heavily on similes and metaphors, which are rooted in daily common experience of medieval English society. Especially in the creation of the characters, similes play an important part, and a significant number of these similes are from food culture. Since quite a number of critics have commented on the literal use of food culture in the general prologue, in this paper, I would like to focus on the metaphoric and symbolic use of food culture and food items in the Canterbury Tales. The first examples I would like to examine are those where consciously or unconsciously an analogy between the human body and food to be consumed is established. In these references, the power relations in the society is reflected in the similes, where the stronger or the dominant power is represented as the consumer, and the weaker is equated to the various food items to be consumed. One of the striking examples is the wife of Bath, who, in her personal prologue, is giving the account of her marriages and is trying to establish the acceptability of remarriage in widowhood. She draws her references from biblical sources and tries to establish the usefulness of marriage by using the bread metaphor. While admitting the superiority of virginity, she says, "Let them be bread of pure wheat seed, and let us wives hotten barley bread. And yet with barley bread, Mark tell can our Lord Jesus refresh many a man," unquote. In the Middle Ages, bread was the staple food of all classes, and it basically came in different colors, ranging from white to quite dark, according to the quality and the fineness of the ingredients. Wheat, rye, barley, oats, spelt were some of the grains that were used for bread making. Wheat was generally to produce white bread intended for the upper classes. This is the production of white, high-quality bread. The lower classes consumed black bread made from less fine meal and a mixture of various grains. Hence, the wife of Bath is accepting the secondary and lower status attributed to wives by the medieval patriarchal system. More significantly, although she is arguing for more freedom for women, in a contradictory manner, she is presenting the female body as food to be consumed by the males. She is contributing to the dehumanization and objectification of the female. In her prologue, she furthers the metaphor, and in relation to her present advanced age, she says, "The flower is gone, there is no more to tell. The bran, as I best can, now must I sell." She continues using the metaphor. Since she is no longer young and fruitful, she must market the leftover husk. She equates herself to the consumed flour. She refers to herself as foodstuff or goods to be sold and consumed by others. In the Miller's Tale, Alison, the miller's wife, is presented in a series of similes, all taken from daily life. She is resembled to fresh flowers, young animals, and food items. She is black as any sloe. The pun here functions to point to a black plum-like fruit. She is said to be softer than the wool of a wether, where again the simile is directly related to a consumable, domesticated farm animal, defining the female as meat which is desired by the three male characters in the fabule, namely her husband Janken, the lover Nicholas, and Nicholas, who is an Oxford clerk, and the unsuccessful suitor Absalom. Her agile body and playful, frisky nature is depicted by means of two species of young farm animals. Thereto could she skip and make game as any kid or calf. Both of these references are to the fresh and tender meat, which is a desirable delicacy to be consumed by the wealthy and the rich. In Adamson's words, food, as the most immediate human need, was a favorite way for the nobility to show their wealth and their exquisite taste, and thereby affirm their status. As Montanari also points out, meat was especially a marker of social status and wealth through which the power dynamics and hierarchies are underlined in the Miller's Tale. Janken's possession of his wife and access to her body is equated with the rights of the wealthy to consume meat, and especially the tender meat of the young domestic animals. Alison is described also with reference to desirable fruits and drinks. The narrator says, "Her mouth was as sweet as braggot or the mead, or hoard of apples in hay or heath." She is resembled to a country drink or mead made of honey, sweet to the palate and to be consumed. In addition to the similes of edible animals, the fruit references enhance the analogy between the human body and edible foodstuffs. The reference to apples is of special significance because they are referred to as a hidden treasure, and at the same time, the apple's association with gluttony and lechery, which were accepted as the basic reasons why Adam and Eve were exiled from the Garden of Eden. Again, Alison is equated to tempting and prized edible food items. In a sense, it foreshadows the adulterous act to take place between Alison and Nicholas. Absalom, the unsuccessful suitor, addresses Alison in terms of sweet-tasting foods and spices. Moreover, he expresses his longing for her in terms of edible material. He says, "I moon as doth a lamb after the teat." He resembles himself to the lamb, wishing to be fed by the milk of the ewe, which is again her bodily food product. These young bodies are all described in edible terms. In The Merchant's Tale, January, who is stated to be an aging knight, uses his superior status and economic condition to pick a young wife. He expresses his wish most appropriately in food metaphors. "I will none old wife have in no manner. She shall not pass 20 years certain. Old fish and young flesh would I have fine. Bet is," quoth he, "a pike than a pickerel. And better than old beef is the tender veal. I will no woman 30 year of age. It is but bean straw and great forage." He establishes an analogy between a young wife of 20 with meat and fish. His choices are appropriate for his position, as he is in a position not only to consume the best and the freshest and the most expensive of the available meat, it is also appropriate for his gender. Bebel proposes that, here we see the fishes he is making reference to, the pike and the pickerel. These are the most expensive ones. Bebel proposes that there's a pattern in Chaucer's use of food references in relation to gender, in that meat consumers are males and females are vegetarian, emphasizing the motive of the male hunting and consuming the female. Similarly, Carol J. Adams, in her book, The Sexual Politics of Meat, points out that people of power have always eaten meat and says, "Dietary habits proclaim class distinctions, but they proclaim patriarchal distinctions as well," unquote. She furthers her arguments by presenting a detailed analysis of the analogy between meat and the female body. In addition to the direct food references Chaucer makes use of, he makes use of the hunt topos, where the power relations between the ruler and the ruled, the powerful and the feeble, and the male and the female are emphasized. In The Merchant's Tale, January, on the night of the consummation of his marriage, is shaven, but his bristly face is given in a simile, resembling him to a shark. This thick breasts of his beard, unsoft, like to the skin of houndfish. This simile is significant and must be taken within the context of a meat-eating predator, as the shark does not appear in any of the bestiaries, as far as I have researched, and seems not to have any other symbolic significance except for the relationship of the hunter and the prey, powerful masculine consumer preying on the flesh of the female, that is May. The wife of Bath, in her prologue, while commenting on the necessity of beguiling husbands, uses the metaphor of the cat and mouse. She says, "I hold a mouse heart not worth a league, that had but one hole for to start to, and if that fail, there is all ado." The wife of Bath refers to herself as the weaker creature in the encounter between the prey-hunting cat and the small, helpless prey, the mouse. If she had not devised tricks by providing more than one hole as an escape route, she will fall prey to her husband, who is to devour her. In The Miller's Tale, Chaucer employs the same simile in describing the attraction of Alison, the carpenter's wife, to Absalom as follows. To look on her, him taught a merry life. She was so proper and sweet and liquorous. I dare well saying, if she had been a mouse and he a cat, he would her hunt anon. The literal and the metaphoric hunt is employed in the portrait of the monk in the general prologue. The monk is depicted as a good rider, and it is specifically pointed out that he owns good horses and loved venery, and his favorite hunt is of the hare. At this point, it is necessary to dwell on the significance of the activity of the monk, both in itself as a method of food acquisition. Montanari emphasizes the importance of the forest as a source of food and how it played a great role in the definition of the identity of the nobility. He says, hunting was the true image of war on a patriarchal and technical level as much as on a metaphorical one. Hunting fully expressed the culture of strength and violence that was consecrated in the practice of war, unquote. Hence, the favorite activity of the monk directly points to his manliness and nobility. Moreover, the kind of hunt he favors is also indicative of his upper class and noble masculinity. The hunting manuals of the Middle Ages give detailed information about the rituals of hunting, and they classify the animals that were hunted. According to the meticulous classification of these sources, the hare is among the noble quarry. Both the French and English hunters of the time regarded this animal with great esteem, as Almond states. Later he says, and their lawful pursuit identified the hunter as gentle hunter. This detail of the monk's portrait, his love of hunting, and especially the hunting of the hare, point to the status of the monk. The portrait also refers to the sturdy horses and the hounds of the monk. This detail, which the Ellesmere manuscript also depicts, is significant because it points out the fact that the monk hunts the hare par force, which was a macrocosm of the most complex and subtle aspects of medieval chase. And it is also distinguished. It distinguished the socially accomplished hunter, and it was the most appreciated hunt form, especially in England. There were other ways of hunting the hare also. The hunt also embraced the consumption of the noble prey. Hence, the monk also consumed the hare in some form or other that he has hunted. The medieval hunting books also devote sections to the preparation and cooking of the hare. The use of forests were an indication of privileges associated with power. In England, it was in the hands of the kings and aristocracy. Sometimes the local potentates held the advantage, such as lords, bishops, and abbeys. The monk is among those who are allowed to go hunting, which qualifies him as noble or of upper class. His skill in hunting underlines his good horsemanship and abilities in the hunt, which indicate his manliness. The hunt of the hare is also significant because it symbolically was associated with sexual power. Due to its reproductive powers, it was associated with lechery. Beryl Rowland draws attention to the fact that Chaucer's monk hunted not only the first beast of the forest, but the animal sacred to Venus. She draws attention to the sexual symbolism of the hare, both in literature and the visual arts, which equated it to the hunt for the favors of the ladies. Here we see both hunts illustrated. In the lower section we see the hound catching the hare, and in the upper section we see the male making advances towards the lady. In this sense, the food items and hunting choice of the monk are strongly related to emphasize his manliness in terms of physical and sexual performance, where the hunter preys upon and devours the body of the prey, which is metaphorically the female body. In conclusion, it can be said that Chaucer makes use of food culture in the Canterbury Tales in diverse ways. As can be immediately realized, he employs food references as markers of class, status, estate, and gender. Additionally, through food metaphors and similes, he reflects medieval power relations and hierarchies where the weaker, the subservient, and the vulnerable are given in edible food analogies. Although most of the characters described in such analogies are women, it is not always limited to this gender. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Erol, for this very interesting and illuminating talk. Now the floor, I think, is open for questions, comments, further remarks.
Thank you, Ms. Chen. It was a beautiful presentation. Short, how many pages, for God's sake? Let's learn.
9 pages, 25 minutes,
Very
double
good.
space.
Most probably you remember the use of food imagery in Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. You know, in the conversations basically between Benedict and Beatrice while they are flirting with each other, you know, sort of it has been geared into the war of the sexes. There, I believe, the 4 humors were in question in sort of deciphering the food imagery. So, what can we say, since you've worked on it? Food imagery exists throughout the ages. Perhaps it's a characteristic of each age, and in this case, the medieval age, to associate food with social and psychological life, traditions, etc. While perhaps in the Renaissance, it most related to 4 humors. I'm not so sure about Shakespeare's other plays. You know, I haven't searched for sure. And in modern kinds of literature, most probably is something certain about that age, the characteristics of that age. Why would you say food is so very important, has been so very important for all the ages, so far as literary production is concerned?
Well, if we take a look at what the food historians and critics have produced, especially for the Middle Ages, access to food, the haves and have-nots, the providers, the eaters, and those who get nothing to eat. Especially with the conditions in the Middle Ages, farming is still in its very early stages. It's only the 12th century when they began to use manure and fertilizers in the field. So the product was sometimes very scarce. In times of war, they killed all the animals, burnt all the products, so it was pure hunger for all the common people when there was an invasion or when there was a war. So possessing enough food, good quality food, definitely implied status. It was like riding a Ferrari, or today having Chinese stuff with gold coating on it, as we sometimes see in the menus of very, very 5-class, 6, 7-class hotels for Christmas or for some other celebrations. So it showed the power of the consumer, but basically it is one of the musts of survival. One of the critics dealing with the sin of gluttony points out, saying that with all the other sins, abstinence is possible. But when it comes to gluttony, it's more difficult because we have to have some food to survive. And the problem is where to stop, how to stop. Again, the more I research and the more the food study areas develop, we see that having access to food, well, it was a way of showing off also. For example, in the Franklin's portrait, the critics cannot agree whether he is a well-established merchant Franklin or if he is a social climber, but in all cases, he is trying to establish his social status by showing off with food, in addition to his costume. I guess it is one of the biological needs. It is still innate in all of us. We always feel, they say that the 21st century will be the century where we're going to deal with obesity mostly. Now, food is more available to more people. But that's also half the truth because Africa and many other areas are starving on the other hand. And we indulge in food. It has also become a means of pleasure seeking. We are eating more than necessary. So it has appeal in many different levels. I hope I could answer.
We're running out of time. There are no questions.
Well, but I see this is such an interesting topic too.
Yes, it is.
I'd like to add a few words in Pride and Prejudice, with which I'm sure most of our students are also familiar. There is a scene, Burçin Hocam, do you remember, when Elizabeth Bennet is visiting Darcy's sister, Georgiana. She had thought that Georgiana was proud and, you know, unpleasant, but she is pleasantly surprised to find out that Georgiana is in fact very shy. And Georgiana is the hostess, but she can't remember her duty as a hostess to offer food to her guests, so her nurse or her companion, chaperone, reminds her that it's time to serve tea and, you know, whatever she's going to serve. And an abundance of a big plate of fruit is brought to the table, and everybody is asked to come to the table. So because their hands are busy, Jane Austen writes, I don't remember the exact words, the feelings of shyness and unpleasant things disappear, so they are all busy. This activity draws them together. It also glosses over certain unpleasant things, satisfies them, and cannot be stopped. Well, if there are no other comments, I'd like to thank Professor Erol again for this very interesting talk. And I'd also like to invite our next speaker, Professor Nazan Tutaş, and her chair, Professor Deniz Bozan.
Evet, bakıyorum, görüyorum. Tamam, oldu hocam.
Evet.
Yanarısın sen de ha şimdi aman düzgün gideceğiz şuradan.
welcome all to the 5th session of this wonderful conference in the person of Lerzan Hoca, the head of the Department of English Language and Literature. I would like to congratulate all my colleagues and their wonderful students here on the occasion of their 20th anniversary. It's great to be here, and thank you for having me to chair this session. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Nazan Tutaç, who is professor of English at Ankara University. She is the chair of the Department of English Language and Literature, and she's also the vice director of the Center for Applied Turkish and Foreign Language Research, which we all know as TÖMEN. She's a graduate of the Department of English Language and Literature at Selçuk University. After completing the master's program in TFL, Teaching English as a Foreign Language at Bilkent in 1993, she was granted a scholarship by the Turkish Higher Education Council for postgraduate study abroad. She received her second MA and PhD from the Center for Applied Language Studies at the University of Reading. She worked as the Deputy Director and Head of the Linguistics Unit of the Department of English Language and Literature at Selçuk University until 2005. She was also the academic coordinator for Konya of the distance BA program in ELT of Anadolu University's Open Education Faculty between the years 2000 and 2004. She has published various articles on the teaching of literature in EFL contexts, reader response approaches to literature teaching, and stylistic analysis of literary genres. She is involved as a translator in the bilingualization of the Word Power ELT Dictionary, English-Turkish, and also bilingualized the Oxford Photo Dictionary for Oxford University Press. She has also contributed chapters to TESOL and PALA publications. Today, the title of her talk is Stylistics in Poetry, an analysis of Roger McGough's Come Close and Sleep Now. Actually, I'm looking very much forward to this because, to the best of my knowledge, he's one of the Liverpool poets, right?
Exactly.
I'm not very familiar with the Liverpool poets, but the Beat generation and the 50s and American Beat poetry, Richard Brautigan and Ferlinghetti and so on, are Ginsberg, of course, are among my favorites. So, yes, so I'm looking forward to this. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Professor Bozar. And I would also like to thank Atılım University and congratulate the 20th anniversary. Thank you very much, Hocam, for inviting me to do this presentation. I would like to start with a quotation from Peter Verdonk about the language of poetry. In general, Verdonk explains the characteristics of poetry as follows. Its meaning is often ambiguous and elusive. It may flout the conventional rules of grammar. It has a peculiar sound structure. It is spatially arranged in metrical lines and stanzas. It often reveals foregrounded patterns in its sounds, vocabulary, grammar, or syntax. It frequently contains indirect references to other texts. So, this is how Leach actually describes stylistics. Stylistics is the study of the use of language in literary texts, especially. Mick Short also defines stylistics as an approach to the analysis of literary text using linguistic descriptions. So the purpose of stylistics, according to Leach and Short, is to explain the relation between language and artistic function. So it enables readers to reach an aesthetic appreciation of a text which connects its specific linguistic features with intuitions about its meaning. And it uses linguistic analysis to understand how messages are conveyed. Wales also argues the goal of most stylistics is not simply to describe the formal features of text for their own sake, but in order to show their functional significance for the interpretation of text, or in order to relate literary effects to linguistic causes where these are felt to be relevant, of course. In this diagram, Widdowson sums up actually the mediating role of stylistics. As you can see, it is a link between linguistic and literary criticism. So wherever you are or wherever you start, you pass through the stylistic stage and arrive at either linguistic or literary criticism. I will quickly go through the history of stylistic, where it, come from. Briefly, you will remember this approach in Western Europe and Northern America grows out of the earlier critical approaches associated with practical criticism and new criticism. In Britain, I.A. Richards and William Epson actually rejected the idea of concentrating on the author only, and they, in order to concentrate on the literary text themselves is very important, they said, and how readers were affected by those texts are important. This approach is often called practical criticism, and it is matched by a similar critical movement in the USA associated with Brooks, Welleck, Boren, and called New Criticism, as we all know. New criticism was based exclusively on the description of the literary works as independent aesthetic objects, but practical criticism tended to pay more attention to the psychological aspects involved in reader interacting with work. However, these two share important features. First of all, an emphasis on the language of the text rather than its author, and an assumption that what criticism needed was accounts of important works of literature based on the intuitional reading outcomes of trained and aesthetically sensitive readers. In the early years of the 20th century, the members of the formalist linguistic cycle in Moscow, the Russian formalists, also rejected, like I.A. Richards, undue concentration on the author in literary criticism, and they favored the analysis of the language of the text in relation to psychological effects of that linguistic structure. So the group contained linguists, literary critics, and psychologists, and began to develop what became a very influential aspect of textual study in later stylistics, called foregrounding theory. This view suggested that some parts of text had more effect on readers than others in terms of interpretation, because the textual parts were linguistically deviant or especially patterned in some way, thus making them psychologically salient or foregrounded for readers. So the Russian formalists were in effect the first stylisticians, but their work was not understood in the West because of the Russian Revolution in 1917, and after the revolution, formalism fell out of favor. Roman Jacobson became one of the most influential linguists of the 20th century, and the reason for this considerable influence on stylistic was because he linked various schools of linguistics together. He left Moscow at the time of the Russian Revolution and moved to Prague where he became a member of the Prague structuralist circle, who were also very interested in the linguistic structure of texts and how they are affected readers. Then, when problems occurred in Czechoslovakia, he moved to USA. He carried the approach which later became called stylistics with him, and helped those who wanted to develop practical and new criticism in a more precise analytical direction. So we talked about foregrounding theory, which is very probably the most important theory in, within stylistic analysis. And as I explained before, ways to produce foregrounding in a text is through linguistic deviation and linguistic parallelism, and we will arrive the foregrounding of a text, in a text. Cases of neologism, live metaphors, or ungrammatical sentences, as well as archaisms, paradox, or oxymoron, are clear examples of deviation. So, deviation, actually, there are different kinds of deviations, such as discoursal, semantic, lexical, grammatical, morphological, phonological, and graphological. To actually exemplify some of them, let's have a look at semantic deviation. Here are the first two lines of a poem called Of Mere Beings by Wallace Stevens. Make Short gives this as an example to exemplify semantic deviation. So we say the first line, the palm at the end of thee and beyond the last. What can we put here in these gaps? The palm at the end of the beach, maybe, or beyond the last hut. So we are actually maybe looking for here concrete nouns referring to relevant objects, like this, or the palm at the end of the road beyond the last hut, probably, house, hut, whatever. But Stevens actually said the palm at the end of the mind beyond the last thought. His choices are semantically deviant, as you can see, and so metaphorical and foregrounded. And these semantic deviations, when examined carefully, can be seen as a key to our understanding of the poem. Wallace's deviant choice here refers to things in the same semantic area, that of human thought. This poem thus appears in the first two lines at least to be about mere minds having decidedly non-mere thoughts. He goes on in the poem to develop this into a characterization of how human emotions are engendered. They are not generated through reason, which he sees as limited, but things which are outside or beyond reason. For lexical deviation, especially neologisms are quite important. Neologism, or invention of new words, is one of the more obvious ways in which writers may exceed the normal resources of the language. I will go through the examples. For example, the prefix for permits to a verb to convey the meaning beforehand, as in foresee, foretell, foreknow. Without noticing the oddity, we would use verbs such as foresell, foreappear, etc. And T.S. Eliot, in his Wasteland, uses foresuffer, for example, makes neologism. Spencer creates new words like shaggy bearded. Hopkins has the widow making, unchilding, unfathering, and some English words originated in poetry in this way, as you can see. the examples. For example, Chesterton says balcony full, or rehatted, or else-minded creates Hopkins. I'll skip these quickly to come to the point. We have graphological deviations. The most typical one, this is again from Roger McGough, 40 Love. The shape of the poem actually shows that there is a net between the couple. There is this tennis match, 40-year-old love. You can actually interpret the title, or as the scoreboard, 40-0. Love in French, I think, means 0. So this, through the shape of the poem, we can see that there is this net between the married couple, middle-aged married couple. We have many different, of course, shape of text, like Christmas tree to show the tree, like E. Cummings, a leaf falling down. Literary writers also choose to express their ideas by managing the type of print, which may include italics, bold print, capitalization, or decapitalization. And syntactic deviations, of course, refers to the grammatical departures from the normal grammar structure. Deviation from subject-verb-object order, for example, in English, which is very typical to poetic language. By Longfellow, for example, out of the bosom of the air, out of the cloud falls of her garments shaken, blah, blah, descends the snow. The deviation from word order. Again, another syntactic deviation. Heavy is my heart, dark are thine eyes, thou and I must part ere the sunrise, from Mary Coleridge. We also talked about parallelism, forms of parallelism, for example, rhyme, assonance, alliteration, meter, and semantic symmetry are the forms. You will remember Shylock's words from The Merchant of Venice. These parallel structures, as you can see through the colors, asking these rhetorical questions, parallel questions, foreground the Jews, that Jews also suffer, bleed, and die just like Christians do, and are just as susceptible to the urge of revenge. We also have another one, a parallel. This is the repetition of the two lines exactly, here emphasizing he has lots of things to do before he dies. Okay, now to exemplify, for the purpose of exemplification of the deviation, parallelism, and linguistic choice in a full poem, I will introduce Roger McGough's poem entitled Come Close and Sleep Now. Roger McGough, as my professor explained, described by Caroline Duffy as the patron saint of poetry. He is the most famous of the Liverpool poets and is still one of the most well-known English poets. He has a BBC program on Radio 4, I think, as Poetry Please. It still goes on, I think, if you are watching. McGough embraces freedom of expression through his poems, subjects, and verse structure. He focuses primarily on the ordinary and everyday, and his poetry is both accessible and popular in that sense. He also wrote many children's poetry or stories. McGough considers poetry a form of subversion. He uses various forms of humor, particularly wordplay, to confront serious topics in an effort to expose the subjectivity of reality. So this is the poem. This is actually typically given by stylisticians to exemplify many deviations and parallelism. As you see, the poem does not have line initial capitals or punctuation. This is typical of Macduff's poetry generally, and indeed of many 20th century poets. These orthographical features thus mark the era of the poem, which comes from post-19th century poem, and are unlikely to have much internal foregrounding significance because of their general prevalence in the text. Beginning with the title, we can have a look at the graphological deviations first of all. As we said, it doesn't have line initial capitals, and the title is, as you can see, "Come Close and Sleep Now," is foregrounded in a standard way by the capitalization and bold typeface. But more importantly, there is no space between the words "come" and "close." And between sleep and now. The title is, in fact, two coordinated main clauses, and in each clause, the word space is omitted between the verb and its adverb modifier. So this graphological closeness, actually, can be as symbolic orthographically of the meaning suggested. There will be no space between the two. Sleep now can have a similar interpretation, but in terms of time this time, not space. So the cozy relations are portrayed whenever we read the title. There is the repetition of the title in the middle of in line 7, actually. This line is a repetition of the title with its graphological closeness effects, and comes at the beginning of the second sentence. As you see, it has two sentences in the poem. The first one, you can see the full stop, it stops there, and the second one starts with "Come close and sleep now." The capital C can thus be explained by the fact that it comes at the beginning of the first word of the second sentence. So we see this capitalization as foregrounding because other letters are not capitalized. And the repetition of the title, and so resuggesting the cozy atmosphere with which the poem starts. We also, graphologically, we have the last lines, "Run all the way home." These are also graphologically foregrounded. All the way written as one word, accelerating the speed, actually. And removal of the spaces in "all the way" can have a symbolic interpretation parallel to the title, but this time to do with speed. So the girl runs home without stopping, and the omission of spaces between the word "all the way" helps to underline the haste and so the strength of her desire to run home, emphasizing the growing guilt, as you can say. And this last emphasis on home here emphasizes that she doesn't belong where she woke up. This is probably, a postcoital relation poem, and she's not happy. She's full of guilt. We will talk about it later. And it also reminds us, intertextually, English nursery rhyme, "This Little Piggy." In Britain, this nursery rhyme is often used in a game with very small children, usually when they are getting ready for bed. and the allusion to the nursery rhyme when the young woman is running home at the end of the poem helps us to confirm her extreme naivety from the perspective of the man. Through the allusion, she is being referred to not just as if she's young and inexperienced, but as if she's a small baby. This little piggy goes all the way home. If we look at the beginning of the poem, it starts like it is afterwards. So it is also deviant, as we can see. We expect the beginning of the poem supplying the information we needed to understand easily what we are being told. But in this case, we are told that it is afterwards, without knowing what went before. So later on, we can infer from what is said that lawmaking was the prior activity, but we don't know this at the beginning. This feeling that we have started the story in media res helps to establish that the poem is not directly addressed to the reader, but that instead we witness what's going on between the two characters in the fictional world they created. Grammatical parallelisms, well, I won't go into the detail, but you will see that if you look at the colorful lines. This, starting from line 7, it contains two coordinated main clauses, come close and sleep now. But the second of these main clauses then extend to the end of the poem with a series of subordinate clauses, some of which in turn have another subordinate clause nested in it. So lots of embedded clauses, as you see. So these embedded clauses also reinforce the intimate relation between them, and we infer the meaning via the grammatical parallelism and parallel semantic grammatical deviations that the young woman's feeling of guilt already awakened by the dawn and increased as she gets dressed. Talk on tiptoe is also a very important semantic deviation. We don't talk on tiptoe, we walk on tiptoe, but here he's analogically, talk on tiptoe suggests that the woman is whispering and talking quietly, which increases the intimacy scene, and this line leads us to infer, again, a metaphorical meaning. Here, when a policeman disguised as the sun creeps into the room and your mother disguised as birds calls from the trees, these clauses are also semantically deviant. First one, the policeman is disguised as the sun, which is impossible, and second one is policeman creeps into the room, which is not likely. So the parallel oddities in the coordinated clauses with the mother phrase also goes on similarly. You will put on a dress of guilt and shoes with broken high ideals. Again, here you expect that the idea that the young woman may indeed have shoes with broken heels and so have difficulty in running home, even though she is so determined, and also that broken heels symbolize the broken ideals to stay chaste, that is. The young woman's feeling of guilt already, as we know, awakened by the sun and she gets dressed quickly and goes home. Of course, there are lots of things to talk about, like phonetic parallelism, etc., but I have no more time. As you can see, talk on tiptoe, alliteration, with the alliteration and the rhyme, it is also deviated. So, in this analysis, we have not commented on everything, of course, in the text. Indeed, we have focused on the matters which seems to be foregrounded and relative interpretively. And we can say that this poem, finally, represents the postcoital thoughts of a man in bed with a younger, sexually inexperienced woman. He's thinking about the feeling of guilt she will have when she wakes up in the morning, and he appears to have a rather ironic attitude towards her naivety in having such feelings of guilt. Indeed, the attitude of the man towards the woman, which seems patronizing, almost cruel, and we feel that we are probably meant to be critical of the patronizing attitude of this man. So, through stylistic analysis, as we see, it's a kind of a toolkit, they say, tools of foregrounding and its type. One can reach to an interpretation of a poem, even if there is no prior knowledge about the literary work. So it uses the scientific and objective look of linguistic analysis and gives the opportunity to realize and enjoy the creativity of poetry. And that's all. Sorry about the rush.
No, you did just fine. Thank you very much.